Good afternoon, folks. This is just an impromptu have a chat to you all because I was a bit bored in between jobs and I was thinking about books, and I thought I'd do a series of book reviews on this channel. So I'm going to divide it into little subcategories. So today I'm choosing to talk about memoirs written by veterans of World War II as a sort of a category. And I'll probably do a show on Normandy books and maybe a show on Pacific books or naval books or war aircraft histories, whatever. But today it's personal stories. So some of these you may have heard of, some of them you won't have heard of. I've got about 8 books here. I'll just run through them and talk about why I like them and what you might get out of them. So the first one, I read it when I was a kid. This is the original copy I had, Men at Arnhem by Tom Angus. Now, when it came out in 1976, and I probably got it much longer after that, late 70s, I'd have been about 10 or 11 when I got it. We didn't know that was his a fake name. He was actually Geoffrey Powell in 156 Battalion Parachute Regiment, 4th Brigade at the Battle of Arnhem. But he wrote under a pen name for whatever reason. And it's one of those books that for me kind of was of a transition from comics to real books. It read like a comic, but it was actually about the Battle of Arnhem. And I reread it in October 2019 prior to going to Arnhem for a few days with my mates. And of the various books I read, getting ready for the Arnhem trip, this is the one I enjoyed the most because it's just like reading an adventure. And it's very thin. You can rattle through it in about a day and a bit, but it's just a crackingly good book about the Battle of Arnhem. I like the Martin Middlebrook examination of the battle. Ian Ballantyne's book is a good examination of the battle, but just as a rip-roaring kind of adventure story, Men at Arnhem, Tom Angus, but real name Geoffrey Powell. So I think the new versions of the book or the current versions have Geoffrey Powell as the author, but my one is Tom Angus. So that's the first one. Second one, now I do love the Pacific Memoir by Eugene Sledge with the Old Breed. It's a really classic book, and of course, everyone's probably watching this or will watching this has seen it or read it already, but I'm going to go for a slightly different Pacific book. Saipan, Suicide Island by Guy Gabaldon. I bought this from Guy himself. He actually signed it for me years ago. Now, there was a movie made about his story, which I forget what it was called now. Now it's come to my head. But it's what's interesting about Guy is he's a little guy, like 5'3", and he grew up in California with Japanese Americans. He was kind of adopted by them, or they adopted him, or something like that. And he grew up with Japanese Americans. So although he writes about the horrors of the Pacific campaign, and we all know we don't need to remind ourselves what horrific things the Japanese did in the Pacific, Guy, because of his upbringing, had a sympathy towards the Japanese and their culture, and he understood them better. Hi, Scott. Scott's watching now. And so his book, and there's a great story where he captures sort of single-handedly dozens, if not hundreds of Japanese soldiers, and he convinces this Japanese colonel to surrender. So it has the kind of what you'd expect from Pacific books. It has the brutality, it has the flamethrowers, it has the winkling Japanese out of caves kind of stuff that you're used to in Pacific books, but it has an understanding of the Japanese culture that, although it was written, 25 years ago or something, it's kind of a refreshing modern way of looking at the Japanese soldier and the Japanese experience. So Saipan, Suicide Island by Guy Gabaldon. There's also a documentary you can find on YouTube where he talks about his war service and also the fact they made this film. And someone will remind me the name of Jeffrey Hunter was in it. You're right, Scott, but I can't think of the name of the No Hero Better something. Look it up on YouTube or on Internet Movie Database. But it's a good movie. Hell to Eternity. Hell to Eternity, that's the movie. So Saipan, Suicide Island. If you want to get to grips with the Pacific campaign, but kind of understand a little bit about the Japanese mentality, that one is I wasn't expecting to do a live show. I just thought I'd do it because I was doing nothing else. So yeah. Next book. Back to the ETO now and the Battle of the Bulge. And this is one inside the Battle of the Bulge, a private comes of age, Roscoe C. Blunt Jr. And again, I was lucky enough to get a copy. Well, I sent off and I got a book plate sent back. Roscoe, that was 2006. That's 15 years ago. 84th Division. Now, the 84th Division US isn't one of the units we think of immediately when we think of the Battle of Bulge. It's 101st, it's 82nd, some of the armored divisions. So the 84th were there. They did their bit, the rail splitters. And his journey is a fairly standard veteran's memoir. And as we know, those of us who read lots of them, they can be a bit samey. Some of them aren't very revealing. Some of them are brilliant. Some of them aren't so good. This one's just good, just solid, good account. You can see his understanding of what warfare does because he travels through Normandy. The 84th came ashore in Normandy, and his introduction to warfare is kind of gentle at the first bit because he sees some bombed out towns and cities and then sort of taken by train up the front, and Geilenkirch and the campaign there and the bit of the Ardennes, and gradually his understanding of how shocking war is comes through. And it's honest, and definitely it's a good, and again, you can nip through it. It's a rip through. It's a really short book, definitely worth reading. So that's my next one. Next one, classic, absolute classic British account. So those of you who are watching who are American or Canadian, you may not be familiar with this. If you're British watching this and you went to Sandhurst or Wolverhampton to do war studies, you'll be aware of this book because it's an absolute staple of what you learn at War College. A Team Platoon by Sidney Jary. It's again another really short book. You can rip through it. It wouldn't be unfair to kind of call it a British Band of Brothers because it's about a platoon officer, Sidney Jary. I like infantry there, but it's more about his platoon, and it carries on the journey beyond the war, in that it talks about the reunions they went to in the 70s. And it's a platoon commander's journey. Now, the only thing that makes it, I think, has not made it a complete classic is he himself didn't join the regiment till after D-Day. So he joins early July, if memory serves, or late June. So you don't get the invasion bit of the story. You get the inland attritional kind of pushing in through the hedgerows, hills, high ground kind of stuff. It's just a great book. It tells you about how a lieutenant has to earn the respect of his men. It tells you how he builds his trust up with them. It talks about patrolling. It talks about how he selects men going out for different things, morale in the field. And of course, it talks about the Germans. And it's just, of the personal memoirs written by men who served in World War II, for the British, it's an absolute classic. But as I say, Americans may not have heard of it, and it's not that easy to get these days. At least when I last looked, it wasn't that easy to get. But if you search on Books or eBay, you'll probably pick up a copy. I think there's a PDF version of it available online, possibly. I don't know. Of course, it's good to have the real book. This one isn't signed. I never managed to get an address for Sid. He died 3 or 4 years. I'd love to have got a signed copy of it. That'd have been great. So that is a classic, standard British combat narrative that it's easy to read, but it gives you a lot of insight into what it's like for the poor bloody foot soldiers in the Battle of Normandy. So that's the next one. Going out of combat now to another aspect of World War II, because remember, this is all going to be personal memoirs by those who actually served or went through World War II. And this is the anticipation of the show we've got coming up on Thursday with Hannah Wilson about Sobibor, because this is one of my favorite books about the Holocaust. Sobibor, The Forgotten Revolt by Thomas Toivi Blatt. Again, it's a signed copy. Toivi was a 15-year-old worker at Sobibor who was part of the revolt that took place where the prisoners escaped. And if it had just covered that part of the story, it would be a great book. It would be revealing about the conflicts as a Jew. You're surviving. You're witnessing the train loads being taken straight to death in the showers with the gas. But he's being used as a worker, so you get some insight into the SS, the control. But also the bit that makes it special is his journey after the war to kind of understand it all. And towards the back of the book, you get this bit where he meets and interviews in Rome, I think it was, one of the sergeants, the SS sergeants or officers who was at the camp, who had survived. He'd been in prison, and the two of them meet. And I won't kind of spoil it, but the German kind of wants to say something to Toivi, and Toivi wants to say something to the German. He also goes off and meets some of the other survivors of the Sobibor. And it's about the war. There's a second book he wrote as well that is more of a complete life story. The Ashes of Sobibor, that's called. This one, The Forgotten, but they're both good, and I could have easily picked up both to show you today, but I showed this one. But if you want to pick one of his books, he ended up living in California after war, and I think ran a TV rentals place somewhere in the suburbs. And there's, of course, the great movie Escape from Sobibor with Rutger Hauer, Joanna Pacula, Alan Arkin, and he's played by a young actor in that. And so that's one of my preferred books that explains a bit about the Holocaust. So that's another memoir that I thoroughly recommend to read. It's kind of shocking. There's some nasty stuff in it. Obviously, it's dealing with the Holocaust, but at the same time, it's a very rewarding read because you understand, like with Unbroken, those kind of books, that it's all about his journey. It's all about Blatt's journey as being a Jew who survived, and the guilt and the association, the revolt, to understanding, if you like, his place in the world. And it's just, he died 2 or 3 years ago, Toivi Blatt. So that's another recommendation. Moving swiftly on, and this won't going to be long, this show. It's not going to be a massive one. I'll try and keep these short. Two, I picked up two by the same guy, Neal J. Stewart. Now, I didn't meet Mr. Stewart, but Sean Claxton, who's done stuff with me on WW2TV, who's another guy I did Normandy, who used to work for me, toured with him in Normandy. And a tanker's memoir. We haven't done a tanker's memoir yet. So Neal Stewart was a replacement officer in the Fort Garry Horse, so Canadian Army now. And I think there might even be a third book in this series. And I think they may have even been kind of self-published. Certainly it was a small publishing house that did them if it wasn't self-published. And you've probably read some other tank memoirs, Ken Tout's books. I recommend them as well. But I recommend these because they're a bit more unusual. There's a photo there, I'll hold it to the camera, of Mr. Stewart when he was in the Royal Tank Regiment, part of Fort Garry Horse, Canadian, as I say, and then as an older guy there. So, Tales of a Tank Man and Steal My Soldiers' Hearts. And they are, like all veterans' memoirs, or all good veterans' memoirs, they are the ones that all explain the battles, but also give a bit of themselves. He talks a bit about his feelings and what he's up to. And you also get to read about engaging German Panthers in the wheat fields of Normandy and that kind of stuff. It takes you through the war. So, I have no idea how easy or difficult these are to find these days. And maybe when I've finished this stream, I can add the details to the books in the description. But I just kind of did it as a random. So, I'll do that later. But yeah, so Neal J. Stewart, Canadian Tankers Memoirs. Hi, Scott, joining us today. So I say they're not going to be long, these shows. The last book, and it's one of four, in fact, a classic, Currahee, A Screaming Eagle in Normandy by Donald R. Burgett. And Don was a mate of mine. Knew him very well. This is one of several signed editions I've got there. So too, Paul, a special friend, Don Love. I get showing off there a bit. It's funny with Don because there are some, I'm not going to say errors, but the way he writes, there are some things that he says sort of happened to himself that he's talking generally about, rather than he puts it, it's written in the first person, but he's actually grouping together memoirs. He was A Company 506. And there are some geographical details that we kind of know now are a bit wrong. But nothing changes what a brilliant, searing read of combat it is. Peter Caddick Adams, I think, quotes from Donald Burgett in Sand and Steel. He was a 19-year-old from Michigan. He wasn't at Toccoa. He joined the regiment later. And went all the way through. So these four books. It's Currahee is the Normandy one. The Road to Arnhem, I think, is the Market Garden one. 7 Roads to Hell is the Baston one. And the fourth one, Crossing the Rhine or something. And they're available in various editions. Poor old Don, though, when he did publish these books originally, there's an interesting story because Don struggled after war. He had shrapnel injuries to his arm from Bloody Gulch, June the 13th, just outside Carrington. And it meant his left arm or right arm was weaker, but he worked in roofing. And his wife would have to kind of tie the roofing hammer into his hand because he couldn't grip it properly to go up the ladder and work on the roof. So he struggled, kids and rural Michigan. And he wrote this memoir, and he'd written stuff down just after the war. And then in the early 60s or late 50s, he actually kind of penned it. And this is the first book. And the funny story he told me is he was taken out to dinner. He got a publishing deal, and he was taken to dinner by the publisher, and it was like the first time he'd been to a restaurant for like years, and he's managed to get a babysitter for the kids. It's him and his wife, and he's been taken out by the publisher. And this is after they sent out a few kind of press copies just to some various people, and Colonel Sink, I think, was sent a copy, and various generals and people like that. And while they're in the restaurant having the meal, the waiter comes over. This is in rural Michigan somewhere, maybe in Detroit, the meal possibly. And there's a telephone call for Mr. Burgett at the restaurant. And don't ask me how this person we'll talk about managed to find out where Don Burgett was. But when you understand who it was, you understand how he was able to do that, because he had some power and influence. And Don Burgett went over to the telephone in this restaurant, and he said his first reaction was, the kids have burned the house down. It's the babysitter saying, we've had to call the fire department. The house is on fire. They've set fire to the dog, whatever, something like that, And so he picked up the phone and said, hello. And his voice said, Mr. Burgett. And Don said, yes. He said, this is Eisenhower. And Don said, yes. And I'm the pink fairy. And Eisenhower said, no, it is Eisenhower. And this is post-presidency. And Eisenhower had received a copy of the book, or been sent a copy of the book. And Eisenhower said to Don in this restaurant, and Don's left the kids at home, it's the best account I've read by a combatant in the ETO ever. If you want someone to endorse your book for you or write a foreword or something, I'm happy to do it. And Don was like blown away that General Eisenhower President Eisenhower at this point, ex-President Eisenhower, former General Eisenhower, had called him out of the restaurant. Now, the sad thing is, and I forget the details of it now, he ended up not doing the foreword for the book because there was a publishing deal. Eisenhower's memoirs were by one publishing house and Don's were by another publishing house or something. And there isn't an edition of the book with a foreword by Eisenhower, although there are various editions. In fact, it was given different titles at various points. There's one a paperback edition Americans got in the 70s, kind of like a comic book kind of cover with like a paratrooper descending. It's called A Screaming Eagle or something. An Eagle Screamed, possibly. Hi, Brian. Brian's watching now. And anyway, but Don's family still have this letter that Eisenhower wrote to Don saying your book was good and we thought it was great. And that's one of the family possessions there that they had. And yeah, despite some of what we'd now know of inaccuracies, when Don wrote the 7 Roads to Hell, for example, he made like a big 6 foot by 6 foot map from memory of how the Bastogne defenses worked. And I've actually got a photocopy of that map in my collection somewhere. And this is pre-Google Earth. This is you're sitting in Detroit, you're writing a book, or Michigan, and you can't have access to stuff. And yet, so his memory, sometimes the geography is a little bit off because he didn't kind of double check all that stuff. But nevertheless, his books still read really well. They still put you in the action. The description of walking through on D-Day from Ravenelville, where he landed, up to, he fought at Marmion Farm, which, if those of you know, that's where some of those famous photos are taken on D-Day. The Bastogne one, there's in the 7 Roads to Hell, there's a description of A Company moving through the forest there, and one of his guys is actually using a 50 cal kind of from the hip, and how he's losing his friend. And it's all about the loss of his friends is what sticks with you. Yeah, hello, David McNay. Hello, World of Tone. Is when they find out, when he loses a comrade, you get that sense of loss. And so the 4 books still work really well as a quartet of wartime experiences. So I'm glad that people like Peter Caddick Adams are cherry picking some of his descriptive language from the books to use in what I would call proper historical studies of D-Day and Bastogne, because these work as they are. They are what they are. It's one guy's recollection of how things were, and There's another book by a guy called Bill Sefton, who was 501st, I think, 101st Airborne. He self-published a book, and he called his book, which also got in the other room signed, It's My War, and I'll Remember It How I Want to. And I kind of like that, because ultimately anyone who served has the right to remember the war how the hell they damn well want to. And if they remember the battle taking place in fog and the reality says it didn't take place in fog, it doesn't really matter. So, I mean, Don was just a great guy, and I miss him a lot. He was just one of those just champion guys. His family, Renee, his daughter, was a friend of mine. We don't always agree on everything politically. I'm a lefty liberal limey living in Normandy, and they're a kind of a sort of Republican conservative family from Michigan, but we get on and respect each other. Bill Sefton there, exactly, and a great book, by the way, as well. So Don's account is what it is. It's a memoir by a guy who was there, and it's all the better for it, and definitely worth reading. I'd really like in the comments after this is done to give me your suggestions of famous memoirs. I mean, I could have picked up another set of books, and in fact, maybe I'll do another show some other time with another set of veterans' memoirs. They were just the ones that, as I looked at my shelves, they kind of leapt out at me to give you some ideas of books to read that aren't the usual ones, because it's perhaps it's good to get someone like myself who's read a lot of books what I think of them, because these days, Pen and Sword churning out books, all these other companies churning out books. There are brilliant ones, there are good ones, there are perhaps some not so good ones. And with all that competitive market, which are the good ones when it comes to veteran memoirs? And most of the ones I've mentioned tonight were written quite a long time ago. Last First Sergeant is another good book. Leighton Black, isn't it, that? With the Jocks is another classic book. Yeah, again, you're now reminding me of all other books I could have brought in here and showed you. But I tend to like the veterans' memoirs written closer to the war than the ones written more recently, because it stands to reason a guy looking back after 70 years as an old man dealing with memory issues and this, that, and the other is maybe not going to remember things as well as a guy as Don Burgett did writing it 20 years after war. He was younger than me when Don Burgett wrote Currahee. Guy Gabaldon, the Marine Corps book, Saipan, he was in his 40s when he wrote it. You're right, there's not many books about the Welsh out there. There's not many memoirs by the British at all, generally. And that's one of the interesting things. I would say, and I hate being negative about my own country, but if I had to select the memoirs from one country only to take with me to a desert island, I probably would take American books more than British books. And you're thinking, hey, he's a Brit, he's being disloyal. It's because I think the Americans had a tendency to be a bit more honest earlier. I'm thinking about my own great uncle in the Royal Ulster Rifles. He talked about battles kind of like it was cricket scores. We came through there, lost 3, gained 6. There was a lack of emotional honesty in a lot of the British books until some of the people like Ken Towton came along later on. Sidney Jary was quite honest. The American books, I think, tended to be more honest earlier. And I think some of that has something to do with Stephen Ambrose. Now, anyone who knows my channel, I'm not the biggest fan of Stephen Ambrose. I think he was a good writer, but not a terribly good historian. But without him popularizing history, people like myself who used to make my living as a tour guide and all the other tour guides and all the popular writers would not be doing what we're doing. He got people reading about World War II who didn't read about World War II. So I think we owe Stephen Ambrose a tip of the hat collectively, even if we can say that some of his books aren't as good as they should, with some mistakes and some slander and plagiarism. But what I think he did do is, and maybe Tom Brokaw helped out with this as well, is that Ambrose made it okay for veterans to be emotional. Does that make sense? Kind of, it's okay to unburden yourselves a bit. They almost became psychiatrist couch confessions a little bit, American books. And British books took a long time to kind of go down that path. Canadian books probably similar to British books. So I think I've got some books by people who are in Colditz and things like that by Brits. And they can be very, there's lots of information in them, but you don't often get the sense of the honesty of a person revealing their real feelings that perhaps you do in the American books. Yeah, Ambrose, don't get me started on Ambrose. It's lots of things. I mean, if we're going on a tangent now, I'm not going to spend here long. This is just a book review show, but one of the things about Ambrose that got repeated in D-Day, and I think it's in Citizen Soldier as well, is that infamous story now of a British landing craft on Omaha Beach, the nervous Royal Navy commander who had to be brought in at gunpoint by an American sergeant or officer because he was too cowardly, this British guy, to bring the boat into the beach. And Ambrose made a big play about that in his book. And for years and years after that, and even after Ambrose's death, the flotilla commander of that British landing craft unit, Lieutenant Jimmy Green, who I also knew, and Bob Sales was in the 29th Division, was in the boat that Ambrose writes about as where this officer had to be brought in at gunpoint. Everybody said it didn't happen. It never happened. There was no gun drawn. Sure, the guy was nervous. He took the landing craft in and it got to the beach and it was the same as everybody else. But Ambrose had heard offhand or something about this gunpoint story. And that's my problem with Ambrose and some other people's problems with Ambrose, is if he heard some kind of sensational story, he'd put it in to give his book a page-turning quality but didn't check it out. There's a story about Ed Shames in Easy Company and Shifty Powers in Band of Brothers in that book that isn't probably true, that he exaggerated. And I think that isn't fair. If you're you're taking sensational stuff and building stories around it just to sell books, that's naughty. And Ambrose did that and did it quite often. Just got lots of things wrong. But that said, I still think his books are worth reading in the sense they're written well. And also, you've got to start with something. And sometimes you've got to read a bad book about something to then recognize a good book when it comes along. So I don't say to people, don't read Stephen Ambrose. I'm saying read Stephen Ambrose, read Anthony Beevor, read James Holland, Peter Caddick Adams, Rick Atkinson, John McManus, Max Hastings, all those other guys. And then if you've read all of them, you'll kind of get your idea of which ones you think, well, yeah, that one seems a bit off the mark. That one seems solid. And only by reading widely like that will you get that sense of where the truth actually lies. Although, as John Buckley said on my historiography show about Normandy a few weeks ago, there is no truth. It's only interpretation. But yeah, so Ambrose is interesting. So that's it. I'm not going to rabbit on for too long. Hi, Robbie, by the way. I nearly picked up Men of Company K. Another book there, DJ Ralph 84. I nearly picked up that one. I nearly picked up Dennis Edwards' book, The Devil's Own Luck, about the Oxen Bucks at Pegasus Bridge. Nearly picked up that one as well to show you. Perhaps I could just do another show immediately, stop this one and go and get another batch of books and come back in 5 minutes time. I might do that. But the point is, I didn't want to rabbit on too long. I just wanted to give you those book titles and start a discussion, really. Indeed, JD, Ambrose, and the Albert Blythe story. There's lots of things. I mean, no author, myself included, no historian has ever got everything right. That would be impossible. The minute you do a book, you do a show, someone says you've got that wrong, and that's how history should move on. You should be able to take on board criticism and work with it. And if someone offers you a bit of advice and says, actually, I think that was the Mark II there, not the Mark III, take it on. So, yeah, so in fact, I'm going to stop this stream. I might just go and get some more books, come back in 5 minutes and do another one. Yeah, what the hell. Those actually got good viewing numbers for a Tuesday afternoon. So, and Mag's out. I'm home alone. And as Mag knows, when I'm home alone, I always get up to some kind of mischief. It's, so I'll do some book reviews. So I'll end this one now and come back in a minute with a few more books. Okay, so see you in a minute. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying, stay where you are. I'll be back in 5.